Sometimes historical evidence is hard to find. Often you have to literally dig up the dirt.
Have you found anything?
Not yet.
Lots of patience, huh?
Or not. Lots of rocks.
At Willamette University campus, archaeologists believe they've narrowed down the search for what was once a boarding school for Native American children from all over the Pacific Northwest, built by missionaries from the Methodist Episcopal Church to house and train them for manual labor. The boarding school lasted only 2 years, ending when the mission was closed in 1844. But the story of how and why it ended is its own story.
This has been a 6-year-long project that we have been on, starting with the Jason Lee House, where we were doing some excavation and we were able to find some of the structure from the original house that was over by Boone's Treasury. Moving on to finding the building that was the parsonage for the missionaries. Jason Lee came out here in the 1830s with a number of missionaries, more followed, and they were starting to do a number of things. The primary purpose was to proselytize to the native tribes. The Kalapuya were the ones that were located here in Salem. They initiated their location up at the Willamette Mission north of Salem, and then eventually he moved down here and he was built a home by the Treasury. This is the Oregon Institute, which was the third of the buildings that was constructed by the missionaries. And the Oregon Institute was originally the Indian Manual Labor Boarding School. So they constructed this in 1842. It was finished in 1842. It only operated for a couple of years. There were a lot of reasons for that. Many of the children who participated in the boarding school died from diseases. Some ran away, but so they were really not very successful in getting it off the ground. It was purchased to become the Oregon Institute, which later became Willamette University. So this is a very historical building for Oregon. What we are trying to do today is try to identify where this building is and locate that boarding school.
The City of Salem's Historic Landmarks Commission, aided by an Oregon Heritage Grant, is investigating this former site with community partners Willamette University, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, and the Oregon Archeological Society. Researchers hope to answer questions about Native American settlement before European American settlers moved in, as well as the operation of the Methodist mission itself. The tools to find facts are a mix of traditional and high-tech, starting with a smart search with ground-penetrating radar.
What it does is it sends out an electromagnetic wave below the ground, and as it changes through different types of sediments or it encounters something that's more dense than something before it, it'll bounce the signal back, and the machine will read it and it'll measure how far down it is, and you can kind of see if there's changes in like soils, or in like this case, there was a gravel layer that had a lot of iron in it, and it was just really bright because radar doesn't go through metal at all. It bounces all the signal back. And so we were able to, there's something here, but we don't know what it is. And so that's why we chose these units. In archaeology, we want to record the archaeological past, the archaeological record, and it's typically done with just paper. But if you wanted to see, like in this case, the two different units, you would have to have two different sheets up and then you have to compare. Well, with LIDAR, you're able to create a model that you can actually have both of them up and see the full thing all together. So this is the 3D model or the digital twin of we did for this excavation unit here, these couple of 1x1s. And in it, you can see we'll come up with the different features that you can see. Like over here, you can see the gravel layer that's in the wall, but you can also see like the edges of where the excavation was stopped. It'll let you measure out the different volumes of the soil that was taken, how far below surface you can go, and it also will give you like able to see different colors in it, and you can use that later on when you're doing the analysis of what was the sediments, what could it be. I've been able to create 3D models of buildings that have been gone since the 1870s, 1880s, and so then you can see what a campus looks like. That will probably be one of the projects we do with this here later on, is trying to see if we can't build a model what the school looked like, some of the outbuildings, and so then you can actually kind of see in space where it was and what it looked like.
Once promising spots are located, there's painstaking digging, sifting, and sorting to do. Today, the public is invited to visit the site and find out what volunteer archaeologists have dug up so far.
Well, so far we have found what could be a feature behind me, all right, or the base of. It's a very compacted river rock, which is usually the base of a foundation, is what we're kind of looking for. And so what we're doing over here is we're checking on a smaller hole to make sure that that foundation doesn't continue over this direction before we open it up into a bigger test area.
What makes that especially exciting?
The fact that if this is the foundation of, we're trying to map this whole area out, and finding stuff that's the big thing, you know what I mean? So the fact that we actually found that there is that foundation there, because all the old maps, you got to keep in mind, they're all hand drawn, and so when you try and overlay them on modern maps, they're off. They're off by quite a bit. So we're able to actually map out those buildings that were here and find out what they were doing inside them as well, because you're going to find a lot of items in there.
How far do you have to dig in order to get to an area where it really is very useful to you for the past, prehistory?
It depends, which is a typical answer in archaeology, because up here we don't have to go very far for what the question we're looking for, which is the Jason Lee Indian Labor School. But in some places, like along the Willamette, on the banks of Willamette, there's a lot of sediment that's deposited. And so sometimes you have to go down several meters. In this case, we're finding stuff about 50 to 60 centimeters below surface, which isn't very far when it comes to archaeology.
Each artifact is packaged and labeled, noting where in the soil layers it was found and what that means. Many were on display for curious visitors. This is quite a collection here. Tell us about them.
So lots of different examples of the ceramics that we have identified. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is understand not just that we have a piece of ceramic, that's great, but there's so many stories that come out of this. Where did this come from? Where was it manufactured? Was it local? What was its use? All of those things are really important, and the more clues that we have from a piece, we'll be able to tell. For instance, this is a piece of ceramic that has a partial maker's mark. And a maker's mark was the stamp that was on, if you've ever been in your grandma's hutch looking at the stuff that she will have, the maker's mark indicated the manufacturer. And so this is a piece, we only have a partial, and we are doing the research now to identify where that had come from. But we believe this is something from the mid-1800s.
That is amazing, and it's a beautifully...
Isn't that lovely?
It is lovely. Ironstone, it says.
It is an ironstone piece. We also have transfer prints in a variety.
It's a Chinese transfer print, but could it have been made, for example, by a firm in London?
Yes, absolutely. So we don't know for sure. We know that trade was coming from China to Hawaii. We also know that the ships were stopping in Hawaii on their eventual trip to come from New York. They came around the Horn and then came up to the Columbia River, stopping in the Sandwich Islands, which is what it was called originally. We know that for a lot of different reasons, but one of the most interesting that we found this mostly at the parsonage, is something called British brick. And British brick was brick that was manufactured using coral from Hawaii. It has a different color, a different texture. It's very, very friable. It's not quite the same. They didn't have lime when they came here, so they couldn't make the bricks initially until they could find, secure, or transport in the sources. So in the very early time, it was coming from Hawaii.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. One of the most interesting pieces I have is this one right here. This was dug up last year by one of our Willamette students who was interning with us.
Oh my.
So it's a very unique pattern. They called this, we eventually found out what this was, and it has its own little story about that, that it is called industrial slipware. The pattern is mocha ware, and it's a cat's eye pattern.
What is that?
That's just what it was called. That was what, the name that from the manufacturer.
What do you think this was a part of? It's curved.
Yes, it was probably some kind of a bowl or jar, but we don't know for sure. Now, the interesting thing about this, when this came out of the ground and we found it, it's very unique. It's different than any of the ones you're going to see here because of the pattern. What we didn't know at the time was that, coincidentally, there was a television show called Time Team UK that I happened to be watching one night about 2 months after we had dug this up. And in that episode of Time Team, we found an art. They were running a story about Burslem, England, in the northeast part of the UK.
It looks just like it.
And the commentator had asked an expert at the museum in Burslem for ceramics why they wanted to keep all of these. And she goes, well, for instance, this is a very rare type of ceramic. You find out that it was Enoch Wood and Sons that manufactured this. It was only made during a 6-year period of time between 1840 and 1846. That's the only time that that particular name was used by the manufacturer. Now, it was in Burslem. The interesting thing was that this was also made for export to New York. Jason Lee came from New York. We also know that there was a Methodist missionary training school adjacent to the Burslem factory. So we haven't made the connection between them, but it's, it stands to reason that the missionaries were aware of these ceramics from an area that was heavily Methodist and had brought it to New York. It made the trip from New York around the Horn to Hawaii and then up through Columbia and then down to Salem. And that is the artifact history that we now have from a 1.5-inch piece of ceramic.
What a find.
What a find and what a story.
And more to come.
And more to come.
So the top gauge was 1/4 and the bottom is 1/8.
Willamette University students and Oregon Archeological Society volunteers will record and process artifacts uncovered at the dig at the City of Salem's Archeological Lab, and we will stay on top of this project as it progresses. Thank you for joining us on InSight OnSite. I'm Wendy Brokaw.